A common question we receive regarding owning commercial real estate is, what are your thoughts on new construction? And like most transactions, there's pros and cons to every type of transaction. New construction allows you to pick the property and to build a building or develop a building from the ground up and make every aspect and every feature exactly the way you want it. You get the finished product of the outside exterior, the aesthetics, the inside, the square footage you want, the layout, the window lines, every specific detail you get to determine. So from that perspective, ground up construction gives you the ability to design the most attractive, most ideal property you can come up with. At the same time, it is the longest transaction, and it is the most expensive transaction, and it is the most time consuming transaction. Most people have the idea, well, I could go find a home builder in a community, pick out a floor plan, and then 5-6 months later, I'm sitting in the living room and we close on the house. In commercial real estate, when you want to purchase land and develop your own property, that's typically an 18 to 24 month process. And by the way, new construction, going through all the zoning and permitting processes, paying for all the different miscellaneous fees, the water taps, the fire department fee, the hookup to gas and electric, it is the most expensive transaction hands down, and it'll cost you more money than any other transaction that you get involved with.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart, and that's a transaction where I've found a lot of doctors say, well, I can just go negotiate the price of the land. You want somebody quarterbacking your team between your lender, your contractor, your equipment specialist. The amount in a purchase or especially a land scenario, it's not even necessarily how much can I save on the land, but what is my time worth? Because it takes a lot of time, and they're throwing easements at you and different title defects. And do you have the time, or what would your time be worth if you could put it back into your practice and have somebody quarterbacking that transaction?
Absolutely. We have helped hundreds and hundreds of healthcare providers purchase land and then develop their own property. And they're typically very, very excited with the end product, but the thing you hear every single time, they'll say, hey, you told me this was going to be the most time-consuming process of any real estate transaction. You told me ahead of time. I agree with you. This was a very, very demanding process, which makes it even more important that you must have the most qualified and talented architect and contractor in the market. You have to have people that know what they're doing, that have done this before, that have partners and other people on their team that are qualified, that are seasoned, that can handle the entire process for you. The architects choose the engineers. They have to use the best engineers possible. The contractor has to use the best subcontractors possible. You have to understand how to navigate cities and municipalities. You have to understand the permitting process. It's incredibly important that your team is comprised of the most qualified and talented people possible.
And you want to make sure that while you go through, as you're evaluating a land opportunity, you've got to make sure that you've got the right amount of due diligence time, because there are so many aspects that if you don't take care of really going through the inspection period and due diligence properly, you're going to set yourself up for greater risk. We've had many clients who have either not gotten an environmental study done, or the phase 1 environmental came back and said, you really need to do a phase 2. And they said, I don't want to pay the money for it. Let's just move forward. Come to find out that now they just bought a $500,000 piece of dirt that they can't do anything with, right? Yeah. Or they've got we had a scenario where a client ended up having to bring in 1 or 2 inches of fill dirt to bring it up over the flood plain in the city that they were in. Well, that was a $70,000 cost they were not anticipating because they didn't go through the due diligence process correctly.
I had a client that we worked with after this transaction, and they purchased a parcel on a major thoroughfare where everything else was well north of $1 million, and it was for sale for $475,000, and they were financeable. They actually paid cash for it. They said, I don't want to miss this opportunity, so they bought it. Come to find out, they didn't have any utilities on that parcel. They had to dig in. It was all in rock. The effective cost of that land once you got it to a pad-ready site was well over $1 million. It was probably closer to $1.7 million. So had they went and bought that $1.3 million parcel, it would have saved them a lot of money. Yeah. And to your point about the due diligence, the bank is really there to protect you, but it's important that you have a lender who understands what you're doing, because it can be hard. Every banker is going to say, yes, I can do this deal. But a lot of them are going to trip up at the finish line once you've already spent a good amount of money. And so, especially when you're going SBA has you're not likely going to get an SBA deal done in 45 days. You have to get all of the due diligence done and almost be ready to start digging dirt the next day, permits in hand, if you're going to go through that type of a process.
Yeah. Let's talk about the things that are important to understand during a land purchase. You've got the most obvious concept of what are the boundary lines? What are the meets and bounds of the property? Are there any easements running through it? You determine that with a very good survey, typically a phase 1, typically an ALTA survey. That's step 1. Step 2, what's the condition of the soil from an environmental standpoint? That comes through in a phase 1, sometimes a phase 2, where they're doing research on the property, they're seeing what were the past uses, what were the uses that were adjacent to this property, has there been anything that's happened in the immediate area that would have negatively impacted this property's soil? That's important. Another thing that most people don't realize is needed when you're purchasing land, you've got to do a soils test. Yep. In Colorado, we have expansive soil, and it's not uncommon for them to come in and say, we have to remove 10 inches of soil and bring in 10 inches of new soil, and then we have to take it out and put it back and take it out and put it back and keep packing it down. We've got to keep putting moisture in there and packing it down, and we've got to try to get as much expansion out of it as possible. We had a piece of property that a client was working on that was a $600,000 piece of ground. It required $1.3 million of site work to get the soil, to get a portion of the soil moved off, to lower the site, to get soil out of there, to build a structural crawl space because the soil couldn't handle slab on grade. And you don't know that until you do a soils report. They're actually going in there and they're boring down in the soil and they're pulling up soil not only 4 or 5 inches deep, they're pulling up soil several feet deep, and they're also checking where's bedrock. If we're gonna drive down caissons or helical piers, are we going down 20 feet? Are we going down 40 feet? Those are things that people don't think of. They just think I'm gonna throw some concrete on some dirt and start building a building. That's not how it works. And even if you wanted it to work that way, the building departments won't let you do that. The civil and structural engineers won't let you do that. There's a lot more that goes into a land purchase than most people realize. It can be handled very seamlessly, but it starts with a survey, it moves on to the phase 1, and then you've got to do a geotech or a soils engineering report to figure out what type of dirt or clay or sand are you working with.
Another thing to consider in these types of transactions is are there any easements on the property? Do you have the access that's required? What are the parking? We've run into a lot of parking easements with a healthcare provider. There's a big parking demand on that property that your practice is going to put on it. So are there other uses that have access to parking there? We had one doctor who bought a parcel. It was a larger parcel, and a savvy landlord owned the whole parcel. He only wanted a part of it. So they cut it up. But when they cut it up, they put a parking easement on the parcel. And so the doctor was not planning to build on it for a few more years. What happened was the developer put a building on the other parcel, and it was too big to support with just their own parking lot, but they had the easement on the other parcel that our client bought. We were eventually able to help them. But our client bought it, and when they tried to put their building on it, the city said, you don't have enough parking here because that other building is utilizing 75% of your spot.
Let's talk about the type of partners you need to have on your team if you're looking at a land purchase. It starts first and foremost with an expert commercial real estate agent that specializes in healthcare, tenant, and buyer representation. Next, if you're not gonna pay cash, you've gotta have a lender that can help you not only purchase that land, but actually give you the additional money you need to build out that property or to develop that building, and then to fully equip it as well. It's not just the real estate purchase, it's the actual building itself, it's the equipment and technology, it's the working capital, it's the full package. Next, you need to have an expert real estate attorney who can help evaluate any common interest community documents, any master plan community documents, who can actually look at the title report, can look at any exceptions. It can help you from a legal perspective. Next, you can't purchase commercial real estate without having an architect and engineers who evaluate that property. They need to look at the survey, they need to look at the phase 1, they need to look at the geotech, the soils report. They need to tell you, what is this gonna cost to build this property? You need to have evaluation and due diligence done with your team before you let your earnest money go non-refundable, and certainly before you close. In order to do that, you also have to have a contractor involved in the process as well. They've got to tell you, this is the estimated cost of the property that you want to build. You can't just assume that you can afford it up front. Materials and commodities change on a monthly basis. Right now, we're filming this post-COVID. There are dramatic changes in prices of steel and other commodities like copper and lumber. 2x4s that used to cost $1.50 a few months ago cost $6 right now each. Can you even get the stone that you're looking for? There's changes in the market constantly. And so you need to make sure that you understand what is the cost of doing this transaction. It's not just the price of the land, it's also the building, it's also the equipment and technology, it's also the working capital. Can I build the building that I want? Can I do slab on grade for my floor? Do I need a structural crawl space? What type of foundation am I going to put in there? There's so many variables that healthcare providers are not thinking of when they're entering a process. That is what an expert advisor will help you with. Let me tell you a story about a client who tried the do-it-yourself approach about buying real estate without doing any due diligence. There was a piece of property that appeared on the outside to be highly desirable. The seller pushed them to close quickly. They paid cash for the property, and they did no due diligence ahead of time. After they closed, they engaged an architect and an engineer, and they found out that there was a utility easement running through the middle of the property, which would prevent them from putting any of their MRI, CAT scan, X-ray equipment in the property. So they paid $1 million cash for a property that they could not use. They later engaged us to help them go find a new property. We walked them through the entire process of performing the correct due diligence ahead of time, making sure that it worked for zoning, making sure that there weren't utility easements or other easements stopping us from building the property that we wanted to. And we helped them find another piece of property, purchase it, go through all the due diligence properly ahead of time, and then they built the property, the building that they were looking for. They later had to turn around and sell that same property because it wasn't usable for what they wanted.
And the likelihood of finding a buyer for that is, I mean, they're probably going to do their due diligence. So now you're sitting on a property, nobody else can likely build on that either. Again, a lot of times properties are cheaper potentially because there's an issue. So don't ever let anybody press you into a timing issue. Timing is imperative on these deals, and you want to make sure that you have enough time to perform the due diligence.